Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Ann Bratt, and I'm the author of the book, Let's Talk About Race and Storytimes. I want to welcome everyone to the sixth meeting of Edie and Neal's book club, the ALA Editions ALA Neal Schumann Book Club. Today, we're exploring themes in the book Narratives of Disenfranchisement, Reckoning with the History of Libraries and the Black and African American Experience. The book was written by Professor Tracey Overbey and Dr. Amanda Folk, who are here to talk with us today. Welcome, Professor Overbey and Dr. Folk. Tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Well, my name is Tracey Overbey, and I'm associate professor at The Ohio State University. I'm also the sociology educational librarian as well there. So I'll pass it to my colleague, partner.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Folk, and I am also an associate professor at the Ohio State University Libraries, and I am the head of the teaching and learning department there.
All right, so my first question is twofold. How have the events of the previous decade and early years of this decade informed narratives of disenfranchisement? And how have events since its publication made it more relevant to library work?
Okay, so I'll go ahead and take the first here. So I would say during the time when myself and Dr. Folk began this study, it was during, like I say, around 2017 when we started the collaboration, wanting to investigate deeper on Blacks and African American students and their relationships with libraries. And unfortunately, during that time, it was during the time when you saw a lot of police brutalities, a lot of Black youth, men, women were being shot down, asked about questions later, and then come to find out no one had a gun on them, but the police. So it was a very volatile time when we began this research. And although we did not plan it this way, it just happenstance during the time when we had started conducting this talk, this narrative, this qualitative study on campus. Um, so it was very important during this time because students, when we were interviewing them, oftentimes Black students are not have that type of platform where they can be heard and express themselves. So that it had really jogged a lot of memory in how they were treated when they entered libraries. And some of the stories as we go along were very impactful on them. To the point where we both can understand now how the field of librarianship is not as diversified, especially when you hear from the Black students and some of the ways that they were mistreated or not informed and things in that sort. So I would say that's how it kind of helped in kicking off of getting the Black students to open up with the study.
I can follow up with that. Professor Overby and I were able to disseminate some of our preliminary findings ahead of 2020, and we were able to give a paper presentation at the Association of College and Research Libraries Conference, ACRL, in 2019 in Cleveland, which happens to be Tracey's hometown. So that was especially exciting for us. And then as we moved into 2020, there were all of the events that Tracey had mentioned, and a lot of people coming together in community, really talking about how can we make things be different for the future, and a scale that maybe we hadn't seen in quite some time. And then, of course, there was also the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and everything kind of shut down. And that was also disproportionately affecting communities of color here in the United States. And Tracey and I really at that moment said, okay, the time is now. We have all of this really rich data about these students' experiences, and we have a captive audience now in a way that we may not have had even just a few years prior. And of course, The events that Tracey spoke about continued to happen over time, and people started to talk about them a lot more. But then also there was this simultaneous kind of pushback on having these kinds of conversations about race in our institutions, whether that's education, healthcare, those sorts of things, including Supreme Court decisions to no longer allow race to be considered in college level admissions. And so we're at this interesting point where there's so many of us who are committed to inclusivity and equity, but also are maybe finding it difficult to speak about, particularly in our professional workspaces. And so I think this work continues to be really relevant and there's more to talk about, but also recognizing that we're kind of at this difficult point in our national history, I'd say.
Tracey and Amanda, what self-discoveries have y'all made as a Black woman and white woman writing this work?
I'll kick us off with this one. I, from a young age, had always been taught to value diversity and have friends who didn't necessarily look like me. And of course, Tracey and I have talked a lot about our experiences over the past several years and our growth. And, I was always interested in learning about different cultures, learning different languages, and being, I thought, an ally to folks who didn't look like me or didn't experience the world in the same way as me. But I also realized, like, okay, I was that, but I had so much to learn. And even though in some ways I felt like I was proactive in my learning, even throughout my formal education, I wasn't necessarily exposed to the scholarship and experiences that I needed to be exposed to in order to actually be an ally and participate in equity work. And through my conversations with Tracey, through my doctoral experience, which then did set the stage for this kind of work, it just became clear that there was a lot that I didn't know, and to be intellectually and personally humble about how I was approaching these kinds of conversations, but also recognizing that as a white woman in a white female-dominated profession, as a tenured faculty member, as a unit head, that I also had a lot of positional privilege and safety in some ways that others did not have. And so thinking about how I can leverage those privileges that I do have in order to help advance these conversations has been a real area of growth for me and continues to be. Like, this will always be an area of growth for me.
And I appreciate that. Amanda is speaking very humble about this. We've had many conversations, heart-to-heart conversations about society and how we're raised and the education system. Black woman, listening to a lot of the students share biases and actions that was done to them, I could relate to them. We shared a lot of experiences. One experience me and Amanda talked about is riding the bus to campus, and how if you're sitting in the bus, if you're sitting in a seat and you're Black, how all the white kids, they with you, not unless it's totally packed and nowhere to sit. And so me and some of the students on campus kind of laughed about that part, how we that, and they had brought it up, and I was like, wow, they do that to you too. So that was something that Amanda and I had shared, that we had witnessed with the students as well. I think as also a woman, a mature Black woman now that has been a youth librarian, teen librarian, worked with many youth as a public librarian many years before I came to academia. What I notice now in evaluating everything is that we need to change the curriculum in the school systems, because a lot of times that's where the narratives are formed about people of colors, particularly Black people. And unfortunately, That's what we still have work to do. But I'm very grateful to have met a colleague like Dr. Folk who was bold enough to work with, I mean, to put this type of work out because she was familiar with grabbing the data, and I was used to, hands on the ground, working with youth, talking with them, collaborating. So I had to learn some things as well with Dr. Folk. But on the other end, I realized that uh, the foundation of these negative narratives about Black students and Black people, it's coming from the curriculums. And we'll go more into that later, but that's from my perspective, what I had gathered and how I could relate to the students.
Let's talk about race and Storytime confronts racism in libraries and develops actionable anti-racist agendas. Your books are framed as narratives, in essence, stories. These are living libraries. What stories are your research and practice telling y'all about racism and anti-racist practice in libraries?
Okay, I'll go first for that one. Shared with me is that, because the profession is predominantly white, uh, female, is that along with the white females and Black people, we've been misinformed in our education system. If you've come, like we all on this call have went through the education system, and if you're constantly hearing a narrative that a people have just been enslaved and they did not contribute anything to society or civilization, they're lazy, they're criminals. So if you've been brought up with that narrative, and then you become an adult, like a police officer or something like that, I can see how they just shoot, they're scared, shoot, shoot, kill, kill, find out later what the problem is. So I'm just going back over the question. What stories are your research and practice telling about racism and anti-racist practice in libraries? Is that, um, you know, many professionals in our field need to be re-educated. Um, Maybe take an African class or Black history or some type of course to kind of break down those negative paradigms that had been fed to all of us through many decades and generations. Um, so that's what I find. And I think if they are heightened and understand some of the contributions that we have made, such as inventions and things in that sort, it could be a level of respect and understanding about Blacks and African Americans. So that's what I would recommend for that.
All right, thank you. So, librarianship remains a largely white profession, and many librarians can speak to early experiences in libraries informing their careers. Do you see a connection between race and story times and how people currently visualize or have historically visualized careers in librarianship?
Yes. So I think especially in the companion volume, Narratives of Disengagement, this is where we really dove into the findings of the interviews that we did with Black and African American college students throughout their lives from childhood on. And what we found was that in many cases, a lot of our students didn't really have a Black librarian role model. Occasionally they did. But even in more urban or diverse settings, it was not unusual for the students in our study to be interacting with predominantly white librarians. Now, that's not always, those experiences were not always negative, for sure. There were definitely stories that they told about positive experiences. But when I walked into a library as a kid, I saw librarians who looked like me. There were plenty of books on the shelves about kids who looked like me. And a lot of the students in our study never really considered librarianship as a potential career option for them because they never really saw themselves in the people that they were interacting with at those libraries. Um, and for some of them, made very real differentiations between Black library spaces and white library spaces, and spaces where they were welcome and spaces where they felt a little less welcome, or like perhaps they were being watched while they were in there. Um, and so as a result, you know, the seeds were never planted for them to think about librarianship as a profession. And I'll pause there and see if Professor Overbey would like to add on to that.
That was great. Great segue. And so like our second book with narratives of disenfranchisement, Amanda and I wanted to make sure that we did not send another narrative when we talk about the historical aspects of Blacks in America. We didn't want to send another, where we're about the dogs biting on the water hoses, and we didn't want to do another spin like that. We felt that we had already it's been enough of our curriculums, right? So disenfranchisement, that part, we looked at more of positive things that from African Americans, such as we ran across some literature from Itabari Zulu, and he shared some research on Africans' presence in education, and talked about the many universities that came up out of Africa long before a lot of European universities like Oxford and things, universities like that. So, and in doing that, what we discovered was Professor Zulu, he did show, and his resources was phenomenal, who he cited as well, how the ancient Africans had a system of organizing and archiving materials because they had mystery school systems and things in that sort. So what we wanted to do with that, what we wanted to share positives of the African-American ancestry, that they didn't just come from, were born as enslaved. So, and we also wanted to share about the redlining. We wanted to bring that out. If you look at in that book, we talk about redlining, we talk about food deserts and things in that sort when you're in heavy Black communities and how resources are not provided in that area. So that was the two difference, how we wanted to present the background of Blacks and African Americans. We wanted to be more positive, but yet share how the disparity with redlining, food deserts, things in that sort affects heavy Black populations.
Thank you so much. And we only have 6 minutes left, but I have still so many, many, many questions. One that I kind of want to tie to make sure that the audience understands is this is your second book. Your first book was The Narratives of Disengagement, Exploring Black and African American Students' Experiences in Libraries. Can you talk briefly about comparing those two and maybe your overall relationship of how you met to work on that and then come back for this second book?
Sure, I can get us kicked off on that one. Actually, they were written together. They came out as a companion volume. We have been working with Rachel Chance, who I saw in the chat. Hi, Rachel. On this. And when Professor Overbey and I really started to think about what could a monograph look like for this particular project, we knew that we wanted to couple the narratives that we were learning about from the students who participated in our study with kind of the historical and contemporary context. And so we were writing all of this together to provide the historical and contemporary context for each type of library, public, school, academic, and show how libraries, even though a lot of times we talk about these being neutral spaces, we exist in these institutions that have never actually been neutral and were designed during periods of time when we were overtly discriminating against people of color, and to be able to tie the contemporary student experience to that legacy. And so what happened is we ended up writing a monograph that was way too long for the special reports format. And so we worked with Rachel to pull those apart. And so narratives of disenfranchisement really presents like the historical overview and the contemporary context for various library settings. And then narratives of disengagement really builds on that and shares the experiences of the students who participated in our study.
Thank you so much. And while we wait for Tracey to come back, I'll still pitch a couple questions and hopefully she'll be able to join us very, very soon. So what did you learn as you from your research around the historic role of parents or other family members and how children grew up understanding race through books or through the oral tradition and their use of public libraries, Amanda?
Tracey, are you back on?
Back on.
Okay, great.
Apologize that. Are we on 5 or 6?
Actually, now that you're back, I'm going to skip ahead one question. We're going to pause that.
Okay.
And I actually want to hear more about the ongoing segregation of schools and practice and how that affects Black and African American experience with literacy in libraries, and then what your research has shows, how your research shows how public and school librarians can help counter that effect.
Okay. Okay. Let me see. Is that a number? Because I know I had my notes written down. I'm sorry.
Muted. I'm muted. Yes,
Oh,
number
okay.
9. Number 9.
Number 9. Okay.
All right.
So you said you wanted to know about the ongoing segregation of schools and practice, the effects of Blacks. Okay. So yes, okay. So I feel that you want to know more about the segregation. So yes, so what we found uh, in talking with a lot of the students, now keep in mind that we were interviewing the cream of the crop that attends OSU. I mean, you have to have a high GPA to get into The Ohio State University. So in talking with the students, and many of them coming from predominantly Black communities, that was, they might have had 1 or 2 interactions with the white librarian. But what we did notice is, as Dr. Folk mentioned earlier, about not having, sometimes they didn't even know their librarian. Sometimes the library in the school was not open. And then when they went to the public library, they did interact more with Black. They didn't even know if they were librarians or just staff, but they did find that when they interacted with them, it was a more kind of family, loving, caring type of energy that they had gotten from the Black librarians or the staff people. So let me see, what was that second part?
How can they help counter that effect?
Okay. Okay, great. So how I would recommend they can counter that, some of that is, maybe some of these libraries can help with internships, hiring students to do certain things and that way they can learn about libraries. But unfortunately, some of the Black students, because sometimes they had that negative experience, and then even if they didn't have a negative experience, they didn't have where someone would kind of encourage them or groom them to go into the profession. Many of them had not even thought about it, becoming a librarian. And the ones that did have a negative experience during the summer reading club, they were turned off and they never even had thought about becoming a librarian. And I think also for the solution with that be, as I stated before, is maybe having interns. What I love about OSU, where we work at, is they have a summer intern every year, where high school students come and they work within certain parts of the library. So if you have a child that is good in computers and programming, they may be somewhere in the IT section, or archiving, preservation. And I think those are good segues to help promote the profession, and also sharing and connecting with the students.
All right. Well, Amanda, for our last one, before we get into part two, let's put the popular phrase, when you know better, you do better, in context as we conclude the first part of this program. So, can you share some examples of training programs that have successfully helped librarians do better and how they address race through their work? And then, Tracey, you can end that with your thoughts as well.
Yes, absolutely. So this is not library specific, but a program that has been really impactful for me and many colleagues at Ohio State, but then also in the Big Ten Academic Alliance in terms of the libraries group there is the Racial Equity Institute, which is based in Greensboro, North Carolina. And many of us have gone through what they call the phase one training, and it's a multi-day institute with these really great facilitators that really have groups of colleagues walk through US history from a racial equity lens in looking at how we got to the present day situation and the ways in which racism uh, is baked into the institutions that we're navigating every day. And so again, I think it does some of what I think Tracey and I were hoping to accomplish with the companion volumes here and thinking about historical legacies and the contemporary situation and understanding how all of these work together and ways in which we can think about how to change those systems. And one thing that I find helpful, and I think others have from that as well, is this groundwater approach to racial equity, which I think can be applied to various kinds of equity, really, in thinking about, are we trying to treat like fish, single individual fish in a lake? Like you come upon a lake and you see one dead fish and you don't really think a whole lot about it, but then maybe you come back a few days later and you see a lot of dead fish in that lake. And suddenly it's not about like what happened to that individual fish, but more of, what's happening in that lake that these fish aren't thriving and that we're seeing a bigger pattern here. And so thinking about the groundwater of our institutions. And that has been a really great catalyst for discussion, I think, in our libraries, but then also throughout the Big Ten Academic Alliance. And they work with a lot of different groups. So that's definitely one training that I would recommend personally.
And what I would recommend is a good old-fashioned book club. I remember when I first had graduated grad and I was working at a school that was predominantly white, but they had Black students there. And one of the English teachers recommended a book club. And so after school, teachers had to, or it was during a lunchtime, but teachers went through the book. They discussed the book and talked about historical things that they might not have known. So that's what I would recommend. Some of the books, as far as maybe today, I would maybe start with Ibram X. Kendi books on the anti-racist books that he has stamped from the beginning. He even now has anti-racist baby board books. So those are great places that I think that librarians who are working with people of color, particularly Black students, and you may come there with the narrative that you see may not be positive. That's what I would recommend. That, and I would also recommend reading Itabari Zulu's paper that he wrote on the ancient Kemetic roots of librarian and information science, because he does tie the library systems to ancient Africa and the universities there. That may be a help to help break down some of these negative stereotypes that we might have been raised with to believe Black people being lazy and criminals and things in that sort. Maybe read about, some places that their ancestors have been and traveled and contributed. So that would be my take.
All right, thank you, Amanda and Tracey. We will get started with our next program, or our next half of this program rather shortly, in about a minute or two. Thanks all.
Okay, he said a minute or two, so I'm guessing this is a minute. I'll introduce myself and then turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Gray. I'm Dr. Beth Patin, and I'm an assistant professor at Syracuse University in our School of Information Studies. I am currently moving through tenure, so I hope the next time I give a talk, I'll be able to introduce myself as associate professor. I'll turn it over to Dr. Gray.
Yes, thank you, Beth. And hello, everyone. I'm Dr. LaVerne Gray. I'm assistant professor at the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. And I'm excited to be here and would like to thank you for the invitation to come and discuss this most important work. And so we're going to continue on with the questions through conversation. And I noticed in the first part you said something about your notes. So, so. I caught that. And so they might deviate just a little bit, but just to place in context and just thinking about the last phrase that was stated, which comes from Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better. Right. And a lot of times that's home words. Right. And so we say that when we think someone is supposed to do better. Right. And that doesn't always happen. But in the context of your work and then some of the work that we do as well in understanding the history of racism and racial identity and what that means in the United States. And the question asks about disenfranchisement, but I want to add on that empowerment because you mentioned it yourself. And because when you say think about things not as being disenfranchised or negative, but think about empowerment perspectives. How does that affect, or how does that contribute or affect to the narratives and stories of Blacks in libraries, and also, and how's that help develop the story of inclusion? Not saying inclusion is necessary, and I'm gonna be radical and say that, but how does it develop that story of inclusion?
I can get us kicked off on this one and then hand it over to Professor Overbey. Thank you for this great question, and also thank you to Jessica as well for all of the great questions that she had for us. One thing that we didn't get to speak about in the first half of today's talk is how did we get, as a profession, how did we get to where we are today? And there's a lot of different ways I think that has happened. This is a complex issue. One is definitely that in throughout American history, there has been segregation in terms of access to libraries, whether that was through Jim Crow era laws or through residential segregation, perhaps happening in the North. But we do have this history of segregation in various types of libraries. And on top of that, we also have this kind of running narrative that libraries are neutral spaces. These are places in which we foster democracy and civic literacy, which is true. But I think sometimes that has also been used as a way to make ourselves feel good without examining the ways in which we might be disenfranchising or marginalizing certain members of our communities in terms of our work, access to our spaces, access to our collections, the types of materials that we have in our collections. And we also know that in the United States, for the most part, white folks don't think of themselves as having a race. We generally move through spaces without our race really being apparent to us for the most part. A lot of the spaces that we go to, people look like us. We often don't experience negative experiences based on the way that we look. And so even, I spoke earlier about how I had a lot of learning to do because I thought I was doing a good job, but actually I did not understand the way in which I was also racialized, but that my obliviousness to that was also affecting the way that I was interacting with various members of my community. And so all of that is to say that this was really an opportunity for us to say, now that a lot of us are starting to know better, like how then do we do better when we recognize that our libraries are not necessarily the neutral spaces that we had always envisioned them to be? The fact that students are telling us that they're having racialized experiences in our libraries, even when that bias was not necessarily overt or explicit, right? And reflecting on some of what I learned from the students that we interviewed, I was like, oh, I could have been that librarian. Like, not intentionally, not intending to do harm, but my obliviousness to kind of these issues, I could have been that librarian that they were talking about. And so I don't think that, we can move to that empowerment and inclusion if we're not also deconstructing the ways in which whiteness and race more generally um, affect our institutions and the ways that we interact with the folks coming in to use them. And Tracey, if you're okay with it, I'll pass the mic to you in terms of thinking about empowerment and inclusion.
Sure. I would like to first say that these questions that you all are asking, they're very good questions. I mean, when I had first got them, I mean, they were really like turning me inside out, like, oh my goodness. And I would just say, sometimes maybe white people may need to have a think tank for them to talk about some of their narratives, their stereotypes. Because I mean, Black people do all the time because, like, why we're not liked because of the color of our skin. So maybe like these questions could be great for the think tank for them because, I mean, they really make you think. But I would say, as far as with empowerment, it's very important because when we look at our school systems and we get to the Black history part in school, in social studies, what do they normally start our children with learning? What we learn: Blacks were slaves, how they portrayed us looking during that time. Jim Crow, things in that sort. So if you start a child with something negative like that, and then other cultures are learning the same things, then it's a sense of supremacy, or a sense of of thinking they're better than the next person. And unfortunately, we're seeing how this is playing out, even though it may be 400 or 500 years later, but we're seeing that that was not a good thing to put in a curriculum to make a people be portrayed as lazy criminals, things in that sort. I've spoken to people from other cultures, Africa, China, and they have shared with me that before they came here, that was what they saw on TV. We were pants sagging, women overly sexualized. So sometimes when they come here and they interact with us, they may have that you may catch that vibe of they're looking down on you, or, they don't have to worry about speaking to you in the meetings and things in that sort, because they have already been preconditioned that, we haven't contributed anything. We've done nothing. So I think it's important for all races to learn about the contributions of everybody, but definitely Black and African Americans, because I mean, I know a lot of cultures have went through other, heinous crimes and have been enslaved. But when you look at Black and African Americans, we're the longest. It has been the most brutal, and we're still catching hell today. And so therefore, I think it's important to start. What's wrong with starting with the truth that, hey, your ancestors built institutions, they built universities, they were doing math way before it was introduced after our enslavement. They had chemistry. They were doing brain surgeries, things in that sort. I mean, but you have to learn this to go when you take a Black history course, you got to learn this. I didn't know this. I was almost 30, so I think it's important to teach even white children, Chinese children, what's wrong with sharing the truth. When you look at back in the day, when Africans had, those were African scholars. When those people were on them boats, they weren't slaves. Those were engineers, they were doctors, they were scholars that was on that boat. So I'm saying if you can present that narrative, I think the world can be better. Because therefore, if your white son grow up to be a police officer, he won't be, oh, I'm scared. Let me kill you first. And then ask questions later and be like, oh, he just had Skittles in his hand. Or, oh, it was just a Coca-Cola bottle. And then you see, and I'm just saying, switching up, then you see other narratives where you may see a white guy, he's cussing at a cop and spitting on him and throwing his water bottle on him. And the cop is literally trying to talk the white guy down. And then it makes Black people think like, well, why we can't get that? So I just think that it's important to start off. If you're going to tell the history, tell it. What are we going to do? If you just share, hey, your ancestors come from great. They weren't born into slavery. So I think it's important, and it would help the profession because it is a predominantly white profession. And therefore, if they're turning our Black children away from going into librarianship, then we may need to go back to the table and say, hey, why don't we just do some good old book club, book discussions, and talk about the things that we've learned that's not true. And I just think that, we'll do better on this planet.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much. And I have one more question, then I'll turn it over to Dr. Patin. In thinking about history, and I thought about this with my own work in dissertation. I wrote about mothers in public housing in Chicago, right? And how that was an information-rich environment. It had nothing to do with the library or these formalized institutions, right? And so I could see the dynamism of what information represented in their context, okay? And to think about going beyond and outside of the mainstream to find evidences of their empowerment, so to speak, right? And of their voice. Okay. And so I'm just wondering, what sources for you, because I had to use their voices. So I had to talk to these observational descendants, these children of these women from the housing projects in Chicago in 1960s. And go beyond what's in just the institutions, right? And so I wanted to know a little bit about the sources that you use, that you found useful for your research.
Do you want me to kick that one off, or would you like to?
You can. I was just wordy on the last one.
No, you. One of our primary sources, and it's hard, I think, for me to think about like disaggregating the two special reports, but for us, the sources were first the students that we interviewed for the research study. And I guess even before then, Tracey and I had talked a little bit about this project and our interest in it. And we had looked through the literature and realized that there wasn't really much in our professional literature elevating the voices of Black and African American library users in particular. And so I think for both of us, going straight to the source and learning from library users from that community was the most important source that we had. And then as we embarked on the special reports, then we went back to a broader set of literature in order to contextualize what we were learning, both for ourselves and then, of course, for our librarian colleagues. And so we looked a lot in the education literature, in the sociological literature. We consulted federal data related to education statistics. We also, when it was available, looked to Library Professional Association data to learn more about the composition of the profession, and then tried to put all of those things in conversation with one another. And then we did have a couple of expert sources who we invited to read some of our work and provide feedback on that, and their perspectives were then incorporated into the special reports as as sources. So that's, I guess, the more traditional academic response to that particular question. Tracey, I know that you've brought up Dr. Zulu a couple of times, but then there's been other sources that you've used in other presentations that we've given to really talk about the historical roots of librarianship in Africa. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so as Dr. Folk mentioned, she's correct. We didn't see too much literature out there on Black students and their relationship with libraries. So we had a plethora of great information talking with the students on the campus. But as far as say some of those women that's, like you say, from the projects of Chicago, if I was to have ran into them and let them know, to encourage them to continue doing the great things that they're doing. I would also like to maybe start off with, and I mean, this may be just basic, but it would help to empower. Maybe one book, Dr. Carter G. Woodson book. There's other authors out here, Dr. Chika Akua. Other books, Anthony T. Browder, Dr. John Henrik Clark, Dr. Ben Johanan. We have many scholars, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, that have written books. Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, he did the study to show that the ancient Egyptians, when tested back then, they were Black. They were heavily melanated people. So I think that we need to empower those mothers, because sometimes when their child comes home and the teacher has suspended him or her because they dropped a pencil or they came in the classroom laughing, just normal kid stuff, and they may get yelled at and turned out round to the office, maybe providing them some information on the school to prison pipeline, sharing with them, sometimes maybe that way. Well, I guess it's so much information, but just sharing with them information that their intuition is not wrong, and that they just need to be equipped with some knowledge when they go into them offices, because oftentimes some of those educators, the mother may not be using proper English or sounding intelligent, but she's on the right page to what she knows when her child is being discriminated against. So just empowering the mothers and parents. I don't want to leave fathers out either. So just empowering those parents who may not have had the opportunity to go to college. And they're just hardworking parents and families. So that's what I would recommend, with just basic books about the knowledge of themselves, their ancestors, because unfortunately the curriculum, they don't give it to us. I mean, my children came home depressed, sad after they learned about Black history. Like, I mean, you saw it in their eyes in the 5th grade, like, oh, we just were slaves and nothing. And so I think that was the beauty also with COVID, because people were at home and a lot of the good information was coming out, about Black inventors. We use inventions every day from Black people, and we may not know about it. The doorknob, clothes dryer, the brakes in our car, the air conditioning unit. We could go on and on. These things need to be brought out.
I appreciate those comments so much, and thinking about Carter G. Woodson's work, right? He told us 100 years ago we were doing this wrong. And I think, there's no better evidence than that than when I cite Black scholars, Black epistemologists, Black theorists, and I get peer-reviewed feedback that I need to explain who these people are. And I think that is really a part of why our thought work is often segregated as an elective, and we're asked to do this extra work to explain who we're in conversation with. And I have my own homage to Carter G. Woodson's work that's called The Miseducation of the Librarian, because we have been miseducated about our community. And so I put that link in there. And I want to switch gears just a bit, although it's really on topic, and it's about my theoretical work on epistemicide and epistemic injustice. So I think a lot about how knowledge is destroyed and how us as librarians, information professionals, and educators have a lot of capacity to do harm in whose information we decide to keep, and how we decide to make it accessible. And I think we need to think about epistemicide in these giant ways, like book bannings, but we also need to think about the harms that happen to us as individuals, as you were saying, Tracey, about how your children felt disenfranchised in classes, right? So we have these moments when our testimony is questioned and dismissed because of who we are. And we have these experiences where people don't understand our language when we're describing our own experiences, or we see lacks of the capacity to participate, or even not having the kinds of curriculums that we need in order to get our work done. And so my question for you is, how did you see the role of epistemicide expressed in the history that you all detailed?
I think this really builds on a lot of things that we've discussed today, and that I've seen in the chat, and some of that is, one, the almost complete absence of Black and African American library users' voices from our professional literature, I think, is a form of epistemicide, because it's not actually representing the fullness of the experiences that library users either have contemporarily or have had historically. And I noticed Dr. Gray put in the chat here about the new course being offered at Syracuse. You know, it's been, goodness, I think 20 years since I was in library school, but I don't remember ever discussing these kinds of issues in any of my library school classes. And so I think the fact that I know that there were some courses about working with multicultural populations, but some of the courses that might have touched on more diverse topics were not part of that core curriculum that everybody was receiving in the program that Tracey and I actually were in the same library school at the same time and didn't know each other until many years later, but the program that we attended. And so somebody put in the chat about kind of Euro-white hegemony in terms of epistemology. And I think that was my experience, certainly in the LIS curriculum 20 years ago. I don't know what that curriculum looks like today, so I can't say that that is the case now. But I also see that as a form of professional epistemicide and professional epistemological hegemony, that we're not talking about these issues. We're not talking about the racialized histories of our library spaces, and we're not talking about how users of different races and with other really identities that have been marginalized historically, we're not talking about what their experiences are necessarily like today. And so I think, you know, within the profession, there has been a form of epistemicide that I think both Professor Overbey and I were attempting to begin to address with this work. I'll pass the mic.
Well said. You hit on everything I was going to say. So yes, I totally agree. Imagine if I mean, when I was in library school, I didn't see anything of a person of color or anything about libraries coming from ancient Africa and universities in ancient Africa. So just imagine if, you know, if that information was weaved into the curriculum of when you're in graduate school. You know, how that would have been empowering for me to go back, because I worked in an inner city public library at the time. So I definitely agree that many resources have been suppressed. And if it had been shared, it could just really just change humanity. So
I agree with that. And I also, I'm sorry to cut you off. I also want us to think about like the richness of the work that exists, right? Because we couldn't do our work if the people hadn't come before us and do this work, right? So there's a rich history of provenance of community information services, even if we have to go to other places to get them. And so I really want us to think about who's a legitimized knower and where we get our information from while we're building our curriculums, while we're designing our classes, and making sure that we too are doing that extra work to find those voices and practicing citational justice to bring them in the ways that y'all are talking about. So this will be our last question, I think, because of time. So my grandparents were civil rights leaders in Alabama, and they spent a lot of time protesting and changing things in Alabama. And my dad was the first Black person to desegregate schools. And yet, if you look him up in the Alabama archives in the Department of History, there's only one or two responses, one or two instances of them in the archive. And so, right, our Black history is missing from some of our big repositories, and that's part of the epistemicide that y'all are talking about. And one of the things that I've found when I'm doing projects on Black communities is that I do have to go outside of some of these more formal sources, because in the past, sometimes our history wasn't worth keeping. And I think one of the things that I've thought a lot about is, like, when our narratives get things wrong, how do we repair those stories? What work do we do and like, how can we fix this through reparative storytelling? And I think one of the really great examples that I found was looking at the story of Dulcina DeBerry, who provided the first information services to the Black community in Huntsville. But as I worked to map this story digitally, there were so many parts of misinformation that we really had to go to other community sources to kind of figure it out. So sometimes we had to go to the elder in our community, right? Who are the community knowledge keepers? What are those other parts of history that you wish you could have captured, but the resources just weren't there? So like in the case of Dulcina, she changed library service in Huntsville, but because she was Black and it was the 1940s, she couldn't go to the library board meetings. But if we were telling library history, we'd use the board minutes. So what does it mean for her voice to be excluded? And how do I make sure I bring that in while I'm doing my research? So that's, I'm like, where is my question? So what else would you have included that just wasn't documented, that you just didn't find while you were working on this book?
So I didn't know.
Would you like to go first?
That was a lot. I'm still kind of taking that in because that was a lot of good information you shared, Dr. Patin. You want to go ahead, Amanda, and I can.
One thing that comes to mind, and so I think one of the strengths of our special reports is that they provide a really high level overview. And so we kind of only just scratch the surface about a lot of different topics to give people that kind of overview for thinking about the historical and contemporary context for libraries. But one thing that we were interested in exploring more was Black Library in Tulsa before the massacre, and so we were able to get a little bit of information. We have a call out box in the Narratives of Disenfranchisement book related to this, but we really had to do a lot of piecing together to determine what the history of that library was, including the librarian and where it was located and was it destroyed in that massacre. And so because of the nature of the work that we were doing, we weren't necessarily doing a really deep dive into that in the way that another historian who would be focusing specifically on that might. But it did take a lot of extra work for us to try and piece together some of the historical aspects of that particular library. Fortunately, there was somebody from the public library out there who was able to help get us some sources. And we didn't get to the point where we had to think more creatively about it, but it was more work than I would think tracing other kinds of library histories might be.
I would definitely say that as well. I was just, Dr. Patin, that story was just powerful, what you were sharing with us. I would say that as well, because when we did dive into, we looked at Black Wall Street and we looked at how libraries were set up in that town. And I think if I wanted to put more in there, but you're right, Amanda. And I think this is the beauty how when we present sometimes, if I can't think of it, Amanda, pull it. So thank you, Dr. Folk. But I would say that part because we wanted to dive into that because that was a town where Blacks were successful. They had their own doctors and post office and everything. So I wanted to elaborate a little more in the book on that, but we just couldn't because as Amanda stated, we were piecing things together and then we contacted the librarian there and it just wasn't a lot of information. But I wanted to also mention what Dr. Patin stated about what else can we do to to bring these stories. I think also we have to do what we're doing. We have to publish, write, keep doing this research. I mean, who else is going to do it? And hopefully we can find other allies to do this with. I'm grateful that I'm able to work with Dr. Folk because she was getting her doctor's degree at the time, and she understood about how to capture this data. So, that's what I would recommend is keep doing what we're doing. We have to put this information out here. Also, we need to change the narratives in these movies. People are tired of seeing the same, of us, in a deficit and things in that. So all of this matters if you're looking at empowerment and if you're looking at trying to help humanity. And since we're in the position of librarian, teacher mode, I think that's what we need to do, is what we do, and keep putting this scholarly work out here.
I think, yeah, that's all we had. I'm sorry. I just wanted to thank you both again. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. Thanks to Jessica and Bratt, to Doctors Folk, Gray, and Patin, and to Professor Overbey. This has been wonderful. The chat conversation has been really rich. Lots of links have been cited in here. People, I hope we can copy them all over. There are so many of them. I think it goes back several dozen pages at this point. But we do want to do a brief audience Q&A. I'm going to quickly close out for those who need to leave now and say again, thanks to all of our panelists, thanks to our audience. If you enjoyed today's event and don't have a copy of the author's books, you can visit alastore.ala.org to purchase any and all of them. Keep joining us for our other free virtual programs. We hold 1 or 2 of them each month, and they will be announced, or continue to be announced rather, at alaeditions.org on our events page there. Our next book club event meets at 1 p.m. Central on Wednesday, March 19th. It is called ALA Tech List 2025. It is a program, a mini conference dedicated to detailing the latest in library technology and also in news briefings and other good information about tech services within the profession. For that mini conference, it will start at 12:30 Central on the 19th of March and end around 4 p.m. Central, but you can drop in and off at any point using the same link for registration. Again, many thanks to those who took in today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of the week for those of you who have to leave now. And any questions that you have for the authors, keep dropping them in the chat and I'll start presenting them. Let's see, our first one is from Jacqueline Laughlin. It is for Amanda and Tracey, for Dr. Folk and Professor Overbey. Can you discuss and share how you both met and what allowed you to collaborate with one another for this project or for both of your special reports?
You want to go, Amanda?
Sure, I could kick that one off. So Professor Overbey and I actually both started at the Ohio State University Libraries in 2016. I think, Tracey, you were March maybe, and I was December. Yeah. There was a few month lag, but in 2017, we had our onboarding meeting to get to know one another and to introduce each other to the work that we were doing. And that meeting, I think, was mostly intended to be about our librarianship or the position description. But we quickly fell into a conversation about scholarship. And I had recently attended a conference on campus about first-year students, and there was this really excellent panel about help seeking and stigma for Black males in the university. And I was like, I've been a reference librarian for most of my life, and it never occurred to me that there might be some sort of different experience for our library users, either based on gender or based on race. And I can't remember exactly how it came up, but Professor Overbey and I started talking more about that and how we both kind of had a common interest in learning more from our students about what that might look like. And then that eventually, very quickly, actually grew into the partnership that we have today, and that continues even after the publication of these 2 special reports. Professor Overbey, anything you'd like to add to that?
That was well said. That's how it started and kicked off. And And it's been great ever since. I'm grateful that Dr. Folk is open-minded. She hears the stories, and I know it sometimes may make her uncomfortable, but I just appreciate her being mature enough to understand and dive into those questions that, you know, maybe we don't get to have a lot with other cultures.
Agreed. And we really feel the camaraderie between the two of you. I've felt it for years now, through your correspondences and through your presentations. So thanks to both of you for joining us. Question for all of the panelists, very timely, obviously, from Bernadette Clover. Your comments are very true, but in the current climate where we have the intent to get rid of DEI or EDSJ and so-called woke information, how can we still press for a total and accurate picture of Black history and culture?
I would say you're going to have to do some legwork on your own. Okay, if they're saying we're not going to be able to talk about it in our classrooms, you know, have book discussions with your family. I mean, go to the park, have discussions when you come home, and books, like I say, Dr. Ibram Kendi, you know, start there. Dr. Miseducation of the Negro. I'm all these names getting to me, but I'm just saying, yeah. So that's how I would start. I wouldn't let this, because I don't know. I think that may be a great start. Amanda, did you want to say?
I think Dr. Gray or Dr. Patin, would you like to jump in?
I just want to quickly say this. I always think about Zora Neale Hurston when someone refers to what might happen, you know, in dark days. And that, and this is from a Black perspective, when she says, we are a magical people, right? And so even and throughout all days, you know, we are able to create and sustain and develop things, right? We don't need permission, right? At all. It might be it's a moment of opportunity, and maybe I'm being overly optimistic. I'm doing a talk later this evening looking at in Chicago at the library about these young people in Chicago in 1920s who created these books, resource books. They're literally reference books, all about the Blacks in the city, right? And so, you know, in a point where we talk about Jim Crow and things like that, they were not even thinking Jim Crow. They're thinking, let's make the Negro better. And I'm using the Negro word because that's what they used at the time. So, you know, I want us to, you know, try to, because it's a lot to process and go and going on. But throughout all of this, I feel like power beneath my feet, you know, because I'm standing on holy ground when I think about my ancestors and everything. So there's truly an opportunity here for us. And don't be discouraged.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Like, we're true to this, not new to this. And I mean that generationally, right? We come from folks who have for a long time had to hide their information and embed their information into different systems. And I encourage us all to do that. I mean, you know, if I can't talk about Black history and teach my classes by honoring inclusivity, I will find another way to teach those classes, right? I don't have to do these through legitimized systems. If the systems aren't going to support us, we build new systems that do. And I think finding ways to build community and find those radical ways to share information, we have to do that. And that's not new for us, right? Like, go back to the 60s and look at what their playbook was, right? Like, when my grandfather started the Community Service Committee to integrate Alabama, they had psychological warfare. That was one of their committees, because they knew that the game wasn't just about changing policy, but it was about changing the minds of the people. And we cannot do that unless we're having these conversations. And yes, while some of them can happen like under the cloak of darkness, we also have to shout it out loud.
Absolutely. Jessica, did you want to contribute something to that question?
Sure. I would say, you know, places and spaces, you'll definitely see the difference between if it's a lifestyle or if you were here for a fad. Because as everyone has captured all throughout history, You didn't need to be in the room from the shaking from the rafters, whether the Harlem Renaissance happened where you were able to secure funds. It took a lot of different ways for slavery from a lot of different spaces for people to overturn a huge institution. So I personally feel that Black people are set up for success, whether they can go and be overt or they can be covert. And no matter where you find yourself in, it might not be the time for you to die on that hill, but there are other ways that you can go around and still get the same impact that you want. So I feel like those pivots, that is a skill that if you do not have, you will need for outside of other skills that you'll need for this next few years.
Thank you all so much for your support and encouragement of everybody who's really needing it nowadays. Question from Megan Heindel, who is actually one of our other authors of a book closely connected to yours, Prepare at Libraries, Empower Teams, one of the co-authors of that book. Her question is, in our school libraries, diverse collections are often the norm, but we're also seeing the collection development of pity seeping into how librarians are selecting materials. For example, I can't buy those high-level books because my kids can't read them. Can you share how you saw low expectations impact Black and African American students, or strategies related to combating this mindset and practice among school librarians?
Yeah, I can maybe kick us off. There may be others who have more expertise than I have in this particular area. As Professor Overbey mentioned, in all of the students who participated in our study were at a pretty highly selective institution and maybe had or had not experienced some of what our colleague is talking about here. However, there were instances in which there just was no library in the high school for students to attend. And there were other situations in which the librarians worked closely with the students from a very young age to improve reading skills. But at least in that second one there were high expectations for that particular student. That student was not facing a low expectations sort of situation. But at least with the students who didn't have access to a high school library, they kind of came to college not really knowing exactly like how to use a library. But I can't say that was untrue for other students as well. And just generally the student populations that we see at Ohio State, maybe not having used a school library before. Also in the narratives of disenfranchisement, we have a couple of citations in there about school impact studies and the importance of having collections and librarians available for students in terms of different kinds of educational outcomes. And there has been some research too about disparities among different kinds of schools in terms of resources and funding. But I don't know that I have anything specific for that question, but that's some of the kind of related things that we learned through our work.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on that, on collections management and how ideas about literacy and what's appropriate for different groups impacts that? If not, we'll move on to our last question, which I see Beth is beginning to answer. The last one, or the penultimate one. How do you undo methodologies and approaches used to address anti-racism work that has primarily been founded on zeal and no training, resulting in harm rather than positive outcomes? Further says, although the intention of creating positive change is noted, some Black and other underrepresented professionals have for years navigated difficult spaces filled with well intentions, yet lacking in actual training and understanding of how to work in this type of work. Some individuals are carrying emotional scars and trauma from very real experiences from engaging in these spaces and are reconsidering their involvement in this work. So again, what advice would you give on that topic?
So I'm curiously, okay, I can post a link here, but I think there's a couple of books there's 3 books that I would recommend. Can everybody see that if I post it in there? Okay, and I'll post the links down here. So I'd say Decolonizing Methodologies is probably, one of the quintessential books in this space about rethinking research and how we approach research from different ways. Research is Ceremony is another great take on how to think about research from Indigenous perspectives. And then finally, I'd say Benia Silva, I might have that name wrong. Like a librarian, I read too much. And then Silva, who has a book, one of his books is Racism Without Racist, which I think is another really fantastic book. But he also has a book called White Masks, White Research, White Logic, White Methods. And so that is another critique about the hegemony that we talked about earlier, and kind of how that has worked its way into our spaces. And I think, part of what we have to do as researchers and as information professionals, as professors, is to make space. I saw Amanda post in the chat, like, we need to make sure as editors that we are making space for other perspectives. We need to make sure that the folks who are doing our peer review understand and have the hermeneutical knowledge to judge work that might be different from theirs. And we want to make sure that we have students that can do that as well, right? So how do we make sure that we involve ourselves in these spaces and continue to make space for work that looks different than ours?
And I would like to add too, because I was trying to understand the question as well. I was thinking, what's an example of this? But just to add that, I'm going back to when you know better, you do better. And sometimes we can learn from these kind of errors, right? And misinterpretation, right? Because there is something called academic freedom. And I co-sign with everything that Dr. Beth Patin has listed as good resources. But what came to my mind, and it's not a research resources, but a book, but it's Toni Morrison's The Source of Self-Regard, right? And there's a lot of essays. It's heavy, but it's instructive at the same time. So she really talks about all the things we spoke of today. So I think that would be a great, reference source or tool book for research.
Awesome. Last question for anybody and for any and all on this panel. In this landscape where librarians are often demonized either as a group or as individuals, how each of you, or one of you, personally fought back against an inaccurate narrative about yourself?
I can start. So my parents growing up made me read this book called Psychic Trauma. And I feel like it might be labeled, it's a very interesting book, but essentially it was saying that you're going to go through life in America and see the whole spectrum of the Black experience. And you cannot take that as a negative toward of like the white gaze, as we call it. So no matter who you meet, if they talk differently than you, that is a part of our culture. So it was like the first for me, as a young kid, understanding and accepting the broad Black experience, and taking pride regardless of what other people may interpret through their own worldview, through their own experiences. Last thing is there's that poem, I think by Lucille Clifton, that every day something has tried to kill me, where it's like if there's no models, you've had to build. I feel like Black people have had to build their own representation. So I felt like watching Black women around me, stuff like that was also very helpful of personally connecting, of regardless, we were never a part of the conversation. They've just magically discovered us. Especially in makeup and other things. So that helped instill a fight against whatever views would be negative towards.
And I would say, like many of our students that come from where their families and their grandmothers and parents shared with them stories of resilience, of still pushing to learn better and to, have education as a priority to achieving. As I was growing up, I know my mom, she kept a book by her bed called Working with the Laws. Now, I always thought the book was about working, how to navigate in the streets with the police officers and things. Then I ended up one day opening the book and we had a discussion about it. It was just about learning how to work with the laws of the universe. And the reason why she shared that with me was because the conversation came, how Blacks are being looked at in society, in the world, and you can rise above that. And you don't have to have that type of, feeling about yourself. And when you're positive, you attract positive people. So I think that has been a foundation that has helped me because I have great friends, different cultures. So like Dr. Folk state, being exposed early. But for those that are not, I would say listen to those grandparents, hear those stories out. And that is what encouraged and motivated a lot of our students in the study to keep persevering. And they did because they got into OSU, and that is a very difficult task, some things to meet, but they met them.
Awesome answer. Beth, did you have something else you wanted to say? Awesome. Okay, well, I want to thank you all again. Jessica did have to depart, but thanks again to our authors of Narratives of Disenfranchisement and Narratives of Disengagement, to our contributing authors for Libraries Without Borders, and to Jessica, who wrote Let's Talk About Race in Storytimes. All those books are available for purchase now on alastore.ala.org. And any questions for the authors that you still have, you can email editionsmarketing@ala.org, and we will be sure that they are passed on to the authors. Otherwise, looking forward to seeing all of you next month for ALA Tech Lists, our first mini conference set of editions. And we will definitely continue to have programs related to EDHJ and race in the coming months and years. Thanks all. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, and nice meeting all of you. It was
Thank
been an
you.
honor.